So good day to everyone joining us today in this important deep dive session on assessing the risks of corruption to your business. This virtual event is organized by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime in collaboration with the United Nations Global Compact. On their behalf, I would like to welcome you all in the session today and thank you for your time and interest and your active engagement in advance. Before we start, I would like to kindly draw your kind attention to the available interpretation channels, to English, Spanish, French, and Portuguese. You can choose the channel as illustrated on the screen. You will see the interpretation icon in the bottom of your screen, so kindly choose the language that would suit you best. So for the esteemed audience, we see a big number of audience. We're happy to have this exchange with you. And for the esteemed audience who did not join us in the first webinar, this is the second session of the global webinar series on business integrity. The series of webinars aim to have an in-depth and interactive discussion and knowledge sharing on the steps of building the business integrity in our private sector companies. The webinar series bring together the experts and practitioners who would share from different regions their challenges, their good practices, and learn from each other. In the first session back in December, UNODC and the UN Global Compact discussed the role of the leadership in establishing a culture of integrity, which is the very first step in order to make sure that the whole environment in the business sector is endorsing and is taking enough interest and attention to the business integrity and the business ethics at work. In today's session, we will go to the second step about identifying the potential risks of corruption. What are those risks, how we can measure them, how we can understand them, and then paving the way to develop the policies and the procedures to address those risks. Follow our session, please, until the end, and we will give you more information about the third step and the next steps in our series. We're very much welcome and look forward to your active engagement in today's session. You kindly have the chat bar. You started to already use it, so we encourage you, please, to put your comments, to put your questions in the chat box, and we will make every effort to address them throughout the session. Also, to get to know you more and to know your experience in the topic, we will be asking you a couple of questions in order for us to assess what are the benefits and the expectations that you're going to get and to adopt and steer the discussion according to your expectations. We will use the Mentimeter in a minute for that. Also, to get to know the agenda of today's session, we would like to start with an introduction about the corruption risk assessments, its concepts, importance, and the methodology of how to apply the corruption risk assessment in your business environment. And we will also hear from our dear panelists today about their practical experience and perspective on assessing corruption risks from the private sector perspective. We would then dedicate the time to get some of your questions in the chat box and ask the panelists and to have their comments and to share their knowledge on the questions and to respond to them in the second half of the webinar today. So before I introduce our dear panelists today, I would like to introduce myself to you. I am Mona Salem and I am managing the Regional Anti-Corruption Project in the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. I'm based in Cairo in the Regional Office for the Middle East and North Africa, and I have the pleasure of working on several areas related to combating corruption in public and private sector, and specifically in the area of assessing corruption risks. Our project and our team is supporting some small and medium enterprises in the MENA region to conduct the corruption risk assessment. We have developed some tools to help them to identify and to understand what could be the potential risks in the areas. And now also we try to take it to the second step of developing the compliance programs in order to mitigate and to address those risks. I'm also very much interested to learn from you, being from several regions, having several experience, and therefore I'm very happy to join you today in this webinar. I have the pleasure to moderate the session today and to introduce to you our impressive speakers for today's session. Starting with Ms. Christina Retter, the head of the Governance and Anti-Corruption Department in the UN Global Compact, Ms. Thazer Wen, the Executive Director of Alpha Power Engineering Company in Myanmar, and Mr. Qusay Salama, the co-founder of the Plus One company in Egypt. So before we start with Ms. Christina, I would like to kindly ask you to take a moment to respond to a couple of questions in the Mentimeter. Now you will see on the screen the Mentimeter. You can get the QR code on the screen in a second, and you can kindly get to the website and start to responding to the questions, either using your mobile phone or using your desktop. And here we will see the code that you can kindly use in order to get your understanding about what are the corruption risk assessment. I will stop here, give you a moment to connect, and then we start with the questions together. If the colleagues started to connect to the Mentimeter, I would kindly ask them to give us any quick hint in the chat. Okay, perfect. And also our colleagues from the UN Global Compact, they will kindly see how many people are entering the test in order for us to know, okay, who is joining. So we have a couple of questions. The first one is, does your company assess potential corruption risks? You have the answers, yes, no, or I don't know. We will wait for a few seconds. Okay, I think now we can move to the second question, please. How well do you understand the corruption risks in your business? Do you understand them well, not at all, or to a certain extent? Great, I think we can stop here and start to reflect also on your questions, because we saw that a big number knows about assessing the corruption risk and its concepts, but perhaps we will need to focus a little bit more on how to understand those risks and how to accordingly put the necessary mitigating measures. So also before we start, as some of you know, that for many studies, they have indicated that the company's growth and the performance is lower in the highly corrupt settings. And despite that, there could be some short-term gains in the beginning, the costs of corruption outweigh the benefits on the long term. Also, some of the studies have indicated that the existence or the integrity, the prevalence of integrity in a society would reflect on the growth and the success of the businesses and the growth of the private sector. So, Ms. Christina, we're happy to have you here today, and we would like to comment a little bit on the results that we have seen and to start to understand about the concept of the corruption risk assessment, the risk assessment in general, and the corruption risk assessment in the private sector in particular, because as you definitely also like advocate and know that the understanding the risks would be the first step in addressing them. So we would like you kindly to introduce yourself briefly and let us hear more from you about the concept of the corruption of the risk assessment in general and what comprises the core elements of the risk assessment.
Thank you so much, Mona. Well, Mona already introduced me as the head of governance and anti-corruption of the UN Global Compact. So I joined the team a few months ago, and before that, I worked in the UN Office on Drugs and Crime for almost 9 years, and before that in the private sector. So I have both that experience in the UN and the private sector. And if you can play the presentation now, I can go over what is a corruption risk assessment, the importance and the elements of it. So let's get started. A corruption risk assessment is the mechanism or the steps that a company can take to estimate the likelihood of forms of corruption happening in the company and the impact they would have if they actually materialize. So in other words, a corruption risk assessment is an exercise to identify and assess those weaknesses in the company's operations, processes, interactions, and units that could be leveraged by very bad people to commit corruption. And why is it important? It's important because no company has infinite resources to address every potential risk, every problem and issue that they might be facing all at once. So this exercise really enables you to focus, to allocate your resources in a very efficient and effective way by knowing exactly where your issues lay, where the risks are, and by prioritizing solutions. So this exercise must be the basis of any anti-corruption program of ethics and compliance, because ultimately your anti-corruption program will consist of policies, controls, measures taken and implemented to lower the chance of those risks materializing. So next slide, please. So if you're thinking about doing this in your company, before even started, you have to establish the process. So the first step would be to assign roles and responsibilities, to appoint qualified personnel to lead the process. And you might want to even hire an external consultant to facilitate the exercise. And second, you need to define beforehand some operational processes or logistical aspects. For example, you want to know the timing of your assessment. When are you going to conduct it? With which frequency are you going to conduct it? What sources are you going to use? How are you going to collect the data? Are you going to involve external parties such as business partners and clients as well? How are you going to quantify your risks? Meaning, what do you consider a low, a medium, and a high risk? And finally, what are you going to do with the information? Are you going to report it internally, externally? All of these questions should be defined before even starting. And to help you with that, we have a guide on anti-corruption risk assessments that we will provide the link to you, where you will find detailed information about all of these steps to help you. The last element that you should design before starting is a risk register. This is a matrix or a file where you will be documenting every finding, every part of the discussion throughout your exercise to make sure that you have everything very visible and reported on. Next slide, please. So the first step is to identify your risks. And for this, you need to collect information, collect data. And you might want to start by researching external and internal sources. So think about the context where your company operates. Think about the laws, the legislation, the legal requirements that apply to your company, and maybe about some common risks that are known to your industry. Take a look at maybe corruption cases by other companies, peers, business partners of your industry, but also within. So internally, you're going to look at previous corruption cases or reports, and that will help you have an idea where the weaknesses lay. You can use also interviews, surveys, self-assessments to collect information from your employees and from external stakeholders. And a common way to go about this is to conduct a series of workshops where you're going to invite employees from different units, so from legal, from HR, procurement, operations, and etc., and make sure that those employees you believe are more exposed to risks are there. Because together we're going to brainstorm, we're going to think like a thief and really identify those weaknesses that could be leveraged to commit corruption in our company, in the operations and processes, like I mentioned at the beginning. So during those discussions, you're going to think about the factors that can influence the risk of corruption in your company. So geographic location and industry are key, as I mentioned at the beginning, and you have to keep in mind that if your company has branches or subsidiaries in several cities, different countries, you should do different risk assessments for every location because the risk might be different. The business model will also impact the risk of corruption. If, for example, you rely a lot on external sales agents or subcontractors, you might have a higher risk because you might have lower degrees of control over those parties. Same thing with your organizational structure. If your company is decentralized, you might have a lower control over those branches and subsidiaries than you have on headquarters. The organizational culture also plays a role. So if your company promotes ethical values and teamwork, it might be less vulnerable to corruption than one that prioritizes competitiveness over due diligence, for example. So all of this help you think about the corruption risks that we could see on the screen are those forms of corruption that can happen, whether that is bribery, kickbacks, facilitation payments, embezzlement, money laundering, you name it, you have several options there. And the schemes are the way that those forms of corruption can materialize. So give it a little bit more detail in examples to understand exactly how that bribery could take place in the context of your operations. And finally, consequences are another factor or element that you could discuss within those workshops because it will help you understand the potential impact of those risks if they materialize. So the consequences could be legal, commercial, operational, and reputational. Next slide, please. So once you've identified your risk, the next step is to evaluate them, assess them, or rate them. So you're going to use a matrix like the one we see on the screen, and you're going to rate each one of those risks that you found depending on the impact that it might have if it actually happens and the probability of occurrence. You don't have to go necessarily 5 levels like that matrix we see on the screen. Normally low, medium, high would be enough. And by giving it a rate of probability and impact, you will have a final combined rate that you will take to your matrix, to your risk register. Next slide, please. Once you've assessed the risk, you also have to evaluate the measures and the controls that are in place to mitigate those risks. Maybe there's no control in place, but normally there are. So your job is to analyze if those are effective, partially effective, or ineffective. And for this, keep in mind that there are measures and controls that are very general at the entity level, for example, a code of conduct or an ethics code, versus specific controls that are very particular to certain processes. Also keep in mind that you will have preventive controls versus detective controls. So the same example, the code of ethic would be a preventive control because it would be a way to promote a strong ethical culture or a compliance environment. Whereas detective controls will help you identify wrongdoing within the company. Next slide, please. And so once you've analyzed all of these elements, you have completed your risk register that I mentioned at the beginning. So this chart, you can find it in the guide that we will provide the link for in the end. And so you will have all the information, and at this point, you will be able to calculate your residual risk, which is like the final grade that you're giving to each risk after you've analyzed their profile, but also the controls in place to prevent them from happening. And with this, now you know which risk you want to prioritize and to address first. Next slide, please. And so when you've decided that, which risk to prioritize, you can then think about your mitigation measures, but that we will discuss in the next webinar. I just wanted to give you a sneak peek and to show you this matrix that I found very useful as a first step to think about how you are going to mitigate all of the risks that you found. But I think my 10 minutes are over, so thank you so much, and to be continued. Over to you, Mona.
Thank you very much, Ms. Schroeder. That was really a very useful presentation because it showed us that it's not a one size fits all. It's not like the same thing that we can do in every company, but all the factors that you have kindly mentioned in order to take into consideration the way how we collect the information, the methodology, the frequency of doing it, the participatory approach of the several employees and several departments inside one company that we can consult in order to put our hands on the real risks, so it's not the same risks common or repetitive among all the companies. So thank you very much, and I think this responds well to the colleagues who have mentioned in the beginning to our attendees and participants today, who said that they understand the corruption risks to a certain extent, but not fully. So I believe and I hope that after trying to go step by step in the methodology of assessing the risks, they would be able to identify to a full extent what could be the possible risks. So I thank you very much for that. We will come back to you in the end of the session with some of the follow-up questions, but just very quickly, please, because we had this question from the audience. Are you going to allow the presentation to be shared with them? And I think that was one of the main questions they wanted to ask you. So if you can give us a response to that. Thank you. Ms. Christina, if you still have the microphone, if you can let us know, or even towards the end, if you can share the slides or the information in your screen with the audience. In addition to this, I also saw that many of the participants asked about the guideline you indicated, and for that we will share the link towards the end of these slides, and you will find it on the UN Global Compact website as well. Great. So now we move to our second panelist, Ms. Tozer Wen, and Ms. Tozer Wen has a long business experience in the private sector and implementing the corruption risk assessment, and you reflect the perspective of the private sector. So I wanted to kindly ask you to share with us your thoughts and understanding of why the corruption risk matters and what were the benefits which companies can gain from assessing the corruption risks in their businesses, and what are the benefits that you have directly sensed by it yourself?
Thank you, Mona. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Tu Zhao Wen. I'm the Executive Director at Alpha Power Engineering Company. I'm based in Myanmar. So our company is the engineering company that provide the electrical infrastructure development in Myanmar. So I'm been involved with the corporate governance journey because when IFC IFC came to Myanmar and then put the initiative for the Myanmar businesses to promote the corporate governance for the Myanmar business community. I'm also working with the Myanmar called Myanmar Women Entrepreneur Network, so that promotes the capacity and development of the women entrepreneurs. So I'm really happy to be here to share the experience through my company in our country. You all know about our country, I think. My country, Myanmar, is now in the some kind of the challenges. The political because of that we have a very unstable political situation. So the business for the time being has been very, how to say, unstable. But even there, so we commit to make the risk assessment and then to promote the anti-corruption elements. So if I share with you about the risk assessment in our company, so in my company, doing the risk assessment and imposing measures to mitigate has been a very long journey, because around 2015, during opening up of our country, at the time we have a lot of business opportunities, and then our company have won many bids from the government and the private sector. At that time, the growth of our company is very rapid and very fast. And then our main expertise is to set up the electrical infrastructure across the country. So our project is scattering around the Myanmar. So at the time when we received a lot of projects at the same time, we didn't anticipate to handle such kind of the huge workload parallelly. So what happened at the time is we have to let our project personnel to take care of the other different tasks in addition to their operation tasks. At the time, we didn't have any measures, any control to clarify the rules and responsibilities and then to monitor the process in the operations. So what happened is we have received a lot of the projects. So we've been doing many projects, but at the end we cannot, how to say, manage. We cannot control the operation activity to be competitive, preventing some kind of the risk measure. So we have a lot of risk incidents during the 2 years time, even though we have many job opportunities. Then the management realized, so we cannot do like this. So we need to address the risk in advance so that we can do our job better. And then with the help of the external advisory firm, we established we like to reform all the operations internal activities. So we started with the development of the code of conduct. So COC. In the code of conduct, when we develop, we clearly define the risk or the tolerance of the risk in the operation activities. So in the code of conduct, we noted some risks as a very severe impact, and then the likelihood, the probability is high. So at the time we mark, and then we devoted to avoid, not to mitigate that such kind of the risk. So in short, in the COC, we define the risk, potential risk. So it may be the preventive measure. So in the 2 months time, we can finalize the COC, but it was not the easy task, because during the process time, we encourage our employees to involve in the process, because it is very interesting. Some risks they bring to the table that we overlook. So some senior manager, they didn't see such kind of the risk coming. So better with the cooperation of our team member, we can finalize our COC. In that COC, we can mention the potential risks we may face during our operations. activities. So it is really, how to say, beneficial. But the another element we have to take is, after the COC, we have to communicate that COC with our employees. So we mentioned that this is our risk identification, and that we like to avoid this risk. So for that, for some kind of the risk, we will mitigate. But it is interesting. Some employees are not so convinced, because in our culture, risk, corruption risk, like the, how to say, like the bribery, but it is easily hidden under our culture, like sharing is caring or something like that, because we share or we donate money easily. So it is a little bit of miss of the feeling when you do the business in Myanmar. That's the reason some employees, they are not so convinced that that kind of the risk need to be mitigated or need to be avoided. So at that time, we have to develop the incentive mechanism. So we communicate with our employees. There is a project. If we address the risk, and then we avoid the risk, like kind of the corruption, we don't need to spend money a lot, and then there is some kind of the cost saving. So we put that kind of the cost saving, put it aside, and then we use this amount to give the incentive to the team member. So with this kind of the mechanism, eventually it has been started in 2016. So now until 2021, it is not 100% perfect, but the risk in our operation activity has been really significantly decreased. And then all the employees have the more confidence that some risks they can really avoid, some risks they can mitigate, but the purpose of the process is everybody and their business must be with the high standard of their integrity. So that is the benefit we have at the end of the day. So even though the beginning point is a little bit exhausting, and then we have put a lot of measures, a lot of efforts to develop such kind of mechanism.
Thank you very much, Ms. Wen. That was really helpful to get this experience from the background of the business sector and the private sector. And I see one of the questions in the comments also asking you about, do you think that the employee role is effective, or only the management? Like, the question is asking, how effective can an employee who doesn't have a management role in an organization help to influence in identifying and addressing these corruption risks, in your experience?
Yeah, this is a good question, because I mentioned that during the development of the code of conduct, we have a portion about the addressing the risks. So when we identify the risks, so we encourage our team member to involve in the process. So we have a sessions with the help of our external advisor, the brainstorming together. So that's why I mentioned that some risks seen by our employees are really interesting, but our senior management didn't see it before. So together, when we doing the assessing risk, so it is good that we include all the people, all the team member in the table, because the risk can be different depending on our operations level and the experience. So if we gather together and then we brainstorm it together, and we can see the whole process and the different perspective of the risk, and then we can discover the more risks in our process, and then so that we can put some measures to counter the risk. So that kind of the protection and operation risk. So the best practice is you do exercise, inclusive of all the employees for the business, and then you can identify better the risks you may face during the operational activities.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ms. Wen, because I share also the same opinion with you that all the employees in an organization or an enterprise or a company, even if it's a small or a medium enterprise, can have a say in understanding what could be the potential risks from their operational point of view. So everyone is prone to see different types of corruption risks in its institution, and therefore he would or she would be able to channel them in the discussion over the corruption risk assessment process. Thank you very much for
That's
that.
true.
And just to also to hear from you, like flashes in very quick messages, what difference did you feel after your company has implemented the corruption risk assessment and taken into consideration the mitigation measures? What impact did you feel?
Actually, that impact is one point. It is measure, but another point it is clearly be seen. For example, so when we do the risk assessment measure, so we clearly define in the organization the risk. So everybody at the organization, they understand about the risk, and then which risk they have a right, and then if there is a potential risk, they know who to report, and then they know how to tackle the risk. So the benefits. So we hardly or directly fall into the risk that we didn't see at all, and then there will be surprise, and then there will be huge impact to the organization. So during along that, after implementation of the risk assessment of our organization, we didn't see any surprises. So because most of the risks we already aware and understand, and then we have a countermeasure. So even if, for example, we in our company we have some incidents like the fraud and some theft, but not very big amount. But if we don't have a risk assessment measure, it can be covered up, and then we may not discover that kind of incident even after many years. But we discover such kind of the incident when employee is doing nasty thing, and then he's not honest, now he's manipulating the invoices or something like that, then we can find out in 4 weeks or 6 weeks time, which is the benefit of having the risk assessment implementation measure in the organization. So if we don't have any controls, that kind of the incident may have happened, and then the senior manager didn't know, and then while we may have a surprises when the amount is very huge, and then it can have a very negative impact to the organization. At the time, it will be very late. So that's the benefit we have after we address and we put the reassessment measures in advance in our organization.
True. Thank you very much, Ms. Wen. And now we would like to also move to our third panelist today, Mr. Qusay Salama. And Mr. Qusay Salama has a long experience working and representing small and medium enterprises. And therefore, I wanted to ask you, Mr. Salama, to share with us your views on how to support the small and medium enterprises to understand the risks of corruption, because definitely among our audience today, they are not only coming from big companies, but some of them are coming from the small and medium enterprises that may want to develop corruption risk assessments, but would feel limited perhaps in financial and human resources, and therefore we would like to provide some tips and advice to them on how they can do the corruption risk assessment and make use of the resources. It's a long question, but I would kindly ask you if you take the question to give us a little bit of a brief background about your professional experience.
Thank you, Mona. Thanks for everybody for attending this. Thanks for the presenters before me. They just laid the ground very well. They talked about everything. They covered the risk assessment process very well. My name is Qusay Salama. I come from the business background. I've always been working in business. I graduated computer science. I did a lot of project management in IT projects. a little bit of coding and other things. And then for the last maybe 20 years, I've always been working in small companies. Small companies, I'm talking about the companies that does not exceed 30, 35 employees, like small companies. And I worked in Egypt on through business associations and also with cooperating with the UNODC office on helping SMEs on implementing compliance programs. I also worked in a couple of other things that related to anti-corruption. I'll come to them as I answer your call. But I just wrote points in the shape of advice for small companies when they come to tackle the issue of anti-corruption and compliance and risk assessment. The risk assessment process, as Christina laid it out at the beginning, is very useful, is very important for your compliance program. It might seem complicated. It might seem also what's even harder than complicated is that it requires time and resources that SMEs may not have. So my advice for small companies is that when you think about the problem, do not think of the whole process. Do not think of everything in the process. I see a lot of questions about if we assess the likelihood and how do we assess the impact, and is this enough? And if you think about all the details at one point, it's going to look even more complex than it is. So you just need to start somewhere. Just start somewhere at the process and say, okay, we'll assess the risk somehow, or we'll look at our risk, and then even if we do not follow the full process, and this is my advice, then we do part of the process. I've seen a lot of small companies. I've trained them on anti-corruption compliance and risk assessment. And even the smallest ones, or even the companies that do not know what is anti-corruption and what is fighting corruption, they already are doing some kind of risk assessment, and they're already putting some controls in place. They just don't know it, or they do it with their business hunch. They don't call it a risk assessment process. So there is nothing scary in the process. And then the third very important point is this risk assessment process, and this and the whole of the compliance program is an iterative. The way it's defined is an iterative process. It's a continuous process. It's a journey. So you don't do the risk assessment, build the compliance program, put the controls, mitigate the risks, and that's it. You put you do your risk assessment process, you put your controls, and then you come again to evaluate and look how impactful was it, what went wrong. Through the feedback that comes to you from your employees, through the feedback that the compliance officer or the focal point for this process does with communicating with other people, through the people at the front line. There was one question that talks about how people that are not part of the process or doing smaller parts of the company can influence the compliance program. Of course, they can influence the program through their feedback. Actually, if we want to do this process right, they need also to be part of the identifying the risks itself, because the frontliners are the people that see the risk actually more than the management, in my opinion. So that's a journey you go through. There is a lot of online resources. Christina talked about the UNGC risk assessment guide. There's other guides out there. There is also compliance programs guides that has a small chapter on risk assessment and how to do risk assessment. You can even start, if you're very small, you don't have any resources, you can even start by copying what other companies identified the risk, companies like you in the same field, in the same thing, in the same industry, in the same country, and do a kind of comparison. And then this can give you the seed for your program that next year you assess it again and you look at it and you do another risk assessment and you build on it. There is no there is no problem. There's no mistake in doing mistakes. You just, if you did mistakes through the process, you correct it the next time you look at your process. It shouldn't be scary. And then the last thing I would like to talk about is that SMEs specifically and businesses should join like-minded companies that want to also be ethical, that want to also have compliance programs in place, that want to also do business in an ethical way and be part of the fight against corruption. And if you join those likely-minded people, they call it collective action. It doesn't have to be a big collective action initiative. It can be something small through a business association, your local business association that you're a member of, or the Chamber of Commerce that you're a member of as a business. My effort or my introduction as a small company to risk assessment and anti-corruption compliance in general came across the Egyptian Junior Business Association. It's a business association that I was a member of, and they thought we thought in the out of being we wanted to be responsible to the society, and out of corporate social responsibility, we thought doing business in an ethical way is a good thing. And this people that think like we built some kind of collective action. In collective action, companies also can help each other. If you don't have the resources, then some other company did the same process or can help you with this, and then you get more maturity. So in a brief, it's a journey where your resources, the management of the company, get more knowledge and maturity to achieve a better risk assessment, and then a better controls in place, and a better compliance program as a whole. So that's my 5 cents on the subject.
Thank you very much, Mr. Qasai. And also continuing on the very important ideas that you mentioned in order to help and to encourage the small and medium enterprises. And since you mentioned the role of the business integrity associations and the chambers of commerce, not the exact role, but what they can do or what they can offer to help the small and medium enterprises specifically to go much better on the efforts of combating corruption and ensuring integrity. Especially that I saw one of the comments in the chat, or one of the questions, is to how to motivate the SMEs to take this effort. So what do you think the role would be of the business integrity associations would be in this regard?
If business associations can play a big role by bringing those companies that think alike together. And then incentives. I personally believe in incentives. Maybe not every country is the same. I know this is a global conference. Maybe countries with a well-defined laws and a well-defined fines against corruption, and with the better law enforcement can provide their incentives in a different way. We see this already in countries where if a corruption happened and the company already has everything in place and a proper compliance program, and then it's the company is not to be blamed, but the certain people or blamed less than the certain people that actually took part in the corruption. But in general, I believe we need to incentivize smaller companies to do this. What business incentives for companies, specifically incentives that touch their bread and butter, that touch their doing business. If I'm a big company and I prefer to deal with or to give my business or buy from companies that have a compliance program, then this gives an incentive for companies to put a compliance program in place, and to spend a bit of resources as well, because it's going to transfer into business for them, into revenue for them. Business associations also play a bigger role in the part where they provide information and education and support when companies need support in their implementation of their anti-corruption programs.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Mr. Qusay, for that. I may take some of the comments and try quickly to respond to them myself, representing UNODC, and then we can come back to a second round of questions for your kind selves. Because I see some of the colleagues and the audience in the chat box, they asked about the incentives, and I wanted to draw their kind attention to the fact that UNODC is working right now on a guideline where we would drill down more on the incentives and the sanctions in relation to what the government and what the countries in general can do in order to motivate the private sector to engage more in the anti-corruption and the business integrity area. So I wanted to, it's still in the development phase, but we would welcome all of your comments, participation in it, and we will announce it duly on our website. Also, when you asked about how to assess the corruption risks, and in addition to what Ms. Christina Ritter has mentioned, and also the guidelines that Qusay has referred to, I wanted to also to draw your kind attention to the website of the UNODC, the Business Integrity Portal, where we have also put there some of the basic tools that will help you to assess the risks. As we said, like, you can get some tools in order to help you understand the risks, but it will not substitute completely your role being in the business itself and being in the company itself to reassess and to reconsider and to see even what are the impact of those risks, how urgent, what is the urgency to address those risks. So you will need to customize it to your local context. But we're happy to put now on the screen some of the materials we have in order to guide you through the corruption risk assessment. Also, the final comment before I move to the questions, one of the colleagues also asked about the difference between the fraud risk assessment and the corruption risk assessment. And from my limited experience and knowledge, I wanted to share that the corruption risk assessment would ultimately be better because it will include the fraud related aspects and additional potential corruption risks, either related to the legal aspects in the company, related to the operational aspects, the security aspects. So there are so many different areas or categories of corruption risks, and the fraud risks would be one of them. So we're talking about a more generalized approach. So that was just my very quick remarks to share with you on behalf of UNODC. And I would now also go back to some of the questions you kindly raised to our panel, which relates to how we can use these corruption risk assessments in order to feed into compliance programs. And if I may ask Ms. Tozerwen to share her views briefly on that, because you also kindly explained how the corruption risk assessment has been laid and developed, but how do you see that this would comprise the first step of developing a compliance program? If you can share your thoughts with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mona. Actually, for our company, so maybe there are the best practices out there, but considering for the SME like our company, developing compliance program different from the corruption risk assessment. They actually, for the SME company like us, they are related. So what we practice in our company is, in the COC, we mention every important elements that we need to address for our operations in the COC. So we have other kind of the policy, but we combine the compliance policy together with the risk assessment and then some kind of the risk assessment measure within the code of conduct. In our code of conduct, we have ethical standardization and then some kind of the different element regulations and the practices we have, our vision and mission in the COC. I'm mentioning here is because for the SME, we cannot use a lot of resources to develop such kind of the policy, and then it will be difficult for the SME to address the element. It is important, but considering our limitation in the resources, financial resources, human resources, so we cannot, we cannot, for the time being, it is difficult for the SME to adapt all the good practices like the major organization or larger organizations are doing. So together to your point, for the compliance policy, what we develop together with the risk assessment policy and the risk mitigation measures inside the COC. So by this way, we will have only one handbook that we can refer for our compliance policy as a compliance practice, ethical practice, and then risk measure. So that's the practical thing we are doing. So we will not produce a lot of the policy with a very beautiful booklet and then like that. We will do at one point while we expand our business, and then we have a lot of human resources, and we have a budget as well. So in practically for the SME level here, we usually have together in the corporate on the COC. So that we combine in our code of conduct. But for the compliance policy, we can get some element from the risk assessment measures into that compliance policy, but not in the separate policy we use.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ms. Wen. Especially is that also complementing to what you kindly said, that many studies have proven that at least in 50% of the companies that do have compliance programs, they have less likely opportunities to engage in corrupt practices. So this also shows us and reflect and complement what you have said on the value added of the compliance programs and how this can, over the time, make sure that there is a real integrity spirit inside the company. Thank you very much for that. And if I may ask Ms. Christina Retter also to share her views with us on one of the questions that have been shared by participants in the chat on the reporting mechanism, because some of them have mentioned that sometimes if employees witness certain corrupt practices and they would like to report it, they would fear retaliation and any harm that may come for them. So in your perspective and according to the methodology that you have also developed in the Global Compact, what do you think, the UN Global Compact, what do you think could be the way out from this situation, or how to support the employees to have reporting channels and to minimize this fear of getting any retaliation?
Thank you, Mona, for the question. I'm trying to answer the questions in the chat, but there's so many of them. And it's quicker if I can just speak, I think. But to your specific question, I think it's important for the leadership of the company to understand that it's more beneficial for them to know and to detect a corruption case in the company inside before it gets out. So with that motivation in mind, definitely reporting channels that are effective, as well as whistleblower protection measures, should be designed and implemented in the company, because it's in the best interest of the company's CEO, investors, to find out about these cases before the press does. So to know how to deal with it, to know how to effectively cooperate with authorities. So that's why this is key, a reporting channel, whistleblower protection, and otherwise, well, another option for employees to report this is to go to public authorities outside of the company if it doesn't work inside, if they don't feel, if they don't feel protected and fear for their jobs. So I would say it is key to have that kind of process and channels in place.
True, and thank you very much for your for sharing your feedback. And it's I think it's also a problem in several parts of the world, in different regions, and we will have to work closely on that. And also my 2 cents on this is that legal wise and the legislative framework of the countries also have to ensure that there is a strong whistleblowers mechanism and protection mechanism, so that we can encourage people in both private and public sector to channel their concerns or their any malpractices they may find. So thank you very much, Ms. Christina. And if I also may ask, please, Mr. Qusay to share his views with us on a relevant but a separate point on the codes of conduct, because I know that you have also worked on supporting countries in developing business codes of ethics in the private sector in some of the countries in our region. And there was a question talking about the medium-sized companies that are owned by the family. Like, what would be your advice when it comes to coming up with a code of ethics? Would it help? What was your experience in this regard, and what do you advise?
My advice also remains, Mona, to start somewhere. Some people, like in a program that we developed in Egypt with the Egyptian Business Association, was to have a simple way for companies to build a compliance program. And the first step of this program was to have a simple pledge to integrity pledge, which is I look at it the way it was framed, or the way it was worded. It was a simple code of ethics that says the company, the top management of the company is devoted and keen to put compliance in place and fight corruption in the company, and the simplest policies and procedures there is for that. So you start simple and then grow it from there. A code of conduct is in my opinion the most important tool in the compliance program, and the basic one, because it includes the policies and includes the introduction to the whole staff of the company to the company's beliefs and the company's point of view on fighting corruption. Also, the code of conduct usually starts with the commitment of the top management. There was a question there, and the question that talks about what if the people doing a risk assessment, this exposes people that are higher up in the hierarchy of the company. If the code of conduct of the company is clear, transparent, and supported by the top management and the board of the company, then this should not be a problem. A risk in any function in the company should be treated the same way. The code of conduct also should include policies. As it includes policies, it also should include what will happen if people do not follow the policies and the regulations of the company. I see a lot of even if in the simplest way, but if you have to, the company has to mention what will happen if those policies in place are not being followed. So that's my experience. We wrote a guidance in Egypt for companies to adapt or how to adopt their code of conducts and write a code of conduct. The code of conduct, again, you start with something simple, and when the company matures in doing the risk assessment, that should be reflected in the code of conduct. So the risks that the company finds, that should be reflected in the code of conduct. But a problem that sometimes see that the companies think, oh, the risk assessment process is too complex, it's going to take too much resources, and then we cannot write a code of conduct, and then they get somewhere in between where they don't know how to start. I would say start with the simplest pledge from the management to fight corruption, the simplest policies that you can think of. As I said before, a lot of the companies, even if they do not do a formal risk assessment process and a formal identification of the controls to mitigate the risks, they have some of those. They do it by the business hunch. They know there is a risk of embezzlement, there is a risk of losing cash, there is a risk of stealing money, there is a risk of this and that. So they know it by the business, and then they put some controls in place. They don't identify this as a proper risk methodology. They don't follow the full methodology, but there is always a point to start in every and each of those small companies.
True. Thank you very much, Mr. Salama, because it's also a problem that I saw it myself when I interacted with some of the companies here in our region, is that they do some of the measures and the controls, but they do not have the full understanding or give it a structure, or that there is a system to mitigate the corruption risks. So exactly. Some of them, they do it by practice, but we will need to make sure with them that there is a methodology behind it, there is a structure, even if we definitely start simple, because when we start simple, and as we say, and Ms. Wen was just saying that it's a continuous process, we will step by step, we will make sure that it's we have a system in place, and this system is improving and is giving us the fruits. So this is an important element. And if I may come back or go back to Ms. Christina Retter, just to ask, because you kindly explained the methodology in the beginning for the assessing the corruption risks, and I wanted to seek your also additional information about whether you think that there are some risks that are more urgent to address compared to others, or it's a matter that is totally left to the companies to decide on.
Well, that is what the assessment is for. So there was one question specifically, and I don't know if I can share my screen, on how do you assess that potential impact or possibility of happening, and that just saying low, medium, highs is maybe too subjective, or there might be a dominant opinion that could, be biased. So in order for you to decide which risk to prioritize, so first you need to assess in the most objective way the risks. And for this to happen, well, first I spoke about pre-establishing beforehand some criteria. So this is key to avoid bias in the future. Also, to avoid the dominance of one or two people, it's a best practice to engage several units throughout the companies, and most importantly, those specific employees who are exposed to the risks the most, because they are the ones who will know where the weaknesses are. And so the guide, we will provide the link to it, gives a very specific criteria if you want to get, quantify, not only qualitative, but if you want to assess the risk in a quantitative way. You could do it through percentages. You can, for example, divide the potential risk into different analyses: the reputation impact, the financial, the legal and compliance one, the potential impact in your customers, in your employees, and come up with an average rating based on all of that, a percentage, a number. I explained this really quick, low, medium, high way of rating the risks, because it's a common one and it's simple and easier, but you can get really more quantitative. And this criteria should be pre-established precisely to avoid any risk of bias afterwards. And so later on, when you have your final objective, I guess, grade for each of the risks, you take that into account to decide which one to prioritize. And sometimes you might see that the ones that are riskier, to put it that way, are not necessarily the ones that you can or you should start with. Why? Because it also depends on the costs of the measures and the controls that you would put in place to address that risk. and the potential impact of that measure. So maybe right now you don't have, you have a high risk, but you don't have the resources that it takes to address that risk and have a major impact by doing so. So maybe sometimes, and especially when you fight corruption, you need to start sometimes with smaller victories or quick wins so you can build support to address higher risks. A lot of people have mentioned in the chat risks that are linked to the public sector in certain countries, and extortion, for example, and risks that are sometimes even like outside of the control of the company. So for things like that, you might want to start with those quick wins and address those kind of risks through collective action. For example, you might want to look for other companies who are going through the same situation in your country and build a collective initiative to face, in this case, the public sector for a bigger win. So yeah, it's not only about rating the risk, it's also about thinking about the measures that you could put in place, how much they would cost, and the impact that those would have in order for you to decide which ones to prioritize.
Perfect, because it's definitely an investment choice as well, as you said, and we have at the end of the day limited and scarce resources, so we will have to be strategic to which area to address them. So thank you very much, Ms. Schroeder, for your feedback and information about this as well. Before we conclude, there was one comment that I would like Ms. Wen to share her views, please, with us on whether to have one code of conduct for the company, or the company has to do multiple codes of conduct, or can do multiple code of conducts if they would like to focus on areas other than anti-corruption. What do you think?
From the perspective of the SME, so it would be easier and quicker to implement and follow if we have only one code of conduct, because not only the risk, or whenever for the SME level, whenever we start doing the very good practice, so the best thing is we start focusing on the small things, and then eventually, so when we have a experience, when we have enough resources, we can expand the coverage area bigger and bigger. So for the code of conduct, so in the before 2014, we didn't have any code of conduct. We have some kind of the employment manuals. So in that, so we mentioned for the employees what to do and what not to do, and then the office hour, some kind of the benefits for the employee. That's a very simple. And then most of the SME here, we started with the employment manual. But after having some kind of the risk we have during the operation activities, so that caused as a law, like with the compliance, a little issue with the compliance, and then some issue with the financial sector. And then we started thinking to transform our internal strategy. Then we started with the code of conduct. So it's 2015, and now we still have only one code of conduct. But like I shared earlier, in the code of conduct, we completed all the important elements related to the addressing risk assessment measures, and then compliance measure, and then some kind of the regulations for the employees. So that's why for us, it is enough for us with the one code of conduct instead of the multiple code of conduct. So that for the perspective of the SME.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ms. Wen. And I believe that we can conclude with the colleagues, with the audience we have today. And I would really like to thank you very much, our dear and esteemed panelists for today, Ms. Christina Retter representing the UN Global Compact, Ms. Fadel Wen and Mr. Qusay Salama representing the private sector and the companies working on this area. And I would like to also to thank you for giving me the opportunity to be with you and to moderate the session and to learn a lot really from the experience and the practical elements and aspects that you have kindly shared with us. Also for the great questions that came from the participants, which really reflect how they understand well the value of the corruption risk assessment. And we can, I believe, continue for this very legitimate discussions and very valuable discussions and share opinions about this element in the to continue on that with the UNODC and with the UN Global Compact and in many upcoming sessions. So I thank you very much. And before we conclude, I wanted to kindly draw your attention to the third step or the third session that we will have in our global webinar series of webinars, and it will be on mitigating the corruption risks. We now talked about the corruption risks, and the next step would be on how to mitigate them, how to address them, how to prioritize them, and to put them into action. So this webinar will be on the 22nd of June, and it will be in the time illustrated on the screen now, and we will share with you and you will hear from us more information about it. Also, I saw my colleague, Caitlin, she shared with you in the chat box the link so that you can put and share your feedback. So we would very much look forward to receive your feedback in order to know what are the elements that you would like us to focus on more and to hear your views in general on any of the elements of today's session. So I thank you very much once again. And before I conclude, I ask my dear panelists if they have any concluding remarks to add. If not, we will thank you and leave. Okay, perfect. So thank you. And